The email arrived at 7 in the morning, a cold sentence that cut deeper than any betrayal I had ever known. My pension of $5 million, the money I had earned through 23 years of work, had been terminated 48 hours before payout. There was no greeting, no explanation, just the words, "Notice of benefit suspension." I stared at the message on the glowing screen of my laptop, my hands perfectly still on the keyboard. People imagine shock makes you tremble, but for me it did the opposite. I became frozen, as if my mind had locked itself into calculation mode. My eyes lingered on the top of the email, and that was when I saw it, the detail that changed everything. Someone had copied the Securities and Exchange Commission. That was not an accident. I closed my laptop with deliberate calm and leaned back in my chair. The morning light was breaking over the Hudson River outside my office window, and the city was waking up, unaware that a war had just begun inside the headquarters of Helios Capital. I had given this place my youth, my middle age, and nearly every ounce of my energy. And now they thought they could erase my future with a single line of text. I picked up my phone, dialing a number I knew better than my own. My lawyer, the one person I trusted with secrets I had never told another soul. She answered on the second ring, her voice still thick with sleep. "Willow, it is barely sunrise. They terminated my pension," I said, 2 days before payout. Her silence lasted 3 seconds, maybe less. Then she spoke with clipped precision. "Forward me the email. Do not respond to anyone. Do not sign anything. Can you be at my office later today?" "Yes. I also have a call with HR this morning. Record it. You know the law in New York, one-party consent? Of course." When I hung up, I let the phone rest on my desk. The surface was spotless, everything arranged with military discipline. People used to laugh at my obsession with order, but to me, order was protection. Details were ammunition. I had lived my life with the knowledge that sooner or later, chaos would come for me, and preparation would be the only shield. I should explain something, though not in the way you might expect. I am not a victim here. For years, I had been building a private arsenal, hidden in plain sight, buried inside the very contracts that kept Helios Capital alive. Back in the dark days after the financial crisis, when the world seemed to teeter on the edge of collapse, I had been given the task of rewriting the company bylaws. They trusted me to protect them, and I did, but I also protected myself. I walked to the cabinet in the corner of my office, unlocked it with a small brass key, and slid open the drawer. My hands touched a folder sealed in red tape. 15 years it had sat there, a relic of sleepless nights and quiet fury. I did not open it yet, not now. The time was close, but I wanted to savor the moment when I revealed it. First, I had to play their game. At 9:30 sharp, the video call with human resources began. The director was a young man with too much confidence and too little experience, speaking in phrases that sounded like they had been purchased from a management consultant. He explained that the suspension was a temporary measure, a strategic optimization for cash flow. His smile was the plastic kind, stretched tight across his face. I asked for the board minutes, the legal review, the financial models that had led to this decision. He promised them by the end of the day. He was lying. I wanted him to lie. Lies are only useful once they are written down. Then I asked the question I knew would hit hardest. Why was the SEC copied on the termination notice? His face lost its color. He stammered something about a technical glitch. A glitch that accidentally sends confidential emails to federal regulators. How interesting. I ended the call, saved the recording in 3 different places, and allowed myself a long, slow breath. They had underestimated me. They thought I would take the loss quietly, perhaps negotiate for scraps. They had no idea that 15 years earlier, I had planted a seed on page 47 of the bylaws. A clause designed to bloom only if they tried to take what I had earned. It was not revenge, it was insurance. My daughter knocked gently on my office door just then. She was dressed in her school uniform, eyes sharp in the way only teenagers can be. "Mom, are you okay? You skipped breakfast." I forced a smile and told her it was only a work thing, nothing to worry about. She did not believe me, of course, but she also knew better than to push. I had raised her to be observant, resilient, to hold her worries close until the time was right. Maybe that was a mistake, maybe it was survival training. In families like ours, the line is thin. After she left, I pulled the sealed folder from the cabinet, placed it on the desk, and carefully cut the tape. The paper smelled of dust and patience. I turned to page 47. The words stared back at me, exactly as I had written them all those years ago, when the world was falling apart and loyalty meant nothing without leverage. If any vested pension obligation is revoked without the consent of the beneficiary, an automatic equity conversion shall be triggered. The beneficiary will receive voting shares equivalent to 12% of outstanding common stock. The clause was self-executing. No board approval required. No negotiation possible. Once the termination email had been sent, the process could begin. And there was more. A poison pill buried deeper in legal language so dense that no one but me had bothered to truly read it. Any executive who authorized such a revocation would be personally liable for corporate debts secured by their guarantee. Adrian Cross, our CEO, had pledged his entire empire against the company's credit line. His estates, his yacht, his collection of rare art. All of it would fall like dominoes the moment I pulled the trigger. I closed the folder and placed my hands flat on the desk. My pulse was steady. My mind was clear. I had been waiting for this day, not in eagerness but in readiness. People spend their lives fearing betrayal. I had prepared for it. By noon, I would meet my lawyer and set the next stage in motion. By midnight, Helios Capital would no longer belong to Adrian Cross. And by dawn, the city that had always devoured its loyal servants would wake to find that one of them had finally fought back. I opened my laptop again, and the cracked light reflected my own eyes. Determined, cold, unshaken. The war had begun, and page 47 was my weapon. By the time the elevator doors closed behind me, I had rehearsed my lines 100 times. The Chrysler Building had always felt like a cathedral to me, a place where power whispered in marble and brass. Today it was the setting for my confession. My lawyer Rebecca was already waiting in her conference room, sleeves rolled up, glasses perched low on her nose as if she had been preparing for battle since dawn. She slid a cup of black coffee toward me. Talk. I placed the folder on the table and opened it slowly, letting her read the clause in silence. Her lips moved as she scanned the words, and then she let out a low whistle. Willow, this is a grenade wrapped in legal velvet. I told you back then I was tired of being a pawn, I said. This was my insurance policy. She tapped the paper with one sharp fingernail. You realize what this means. If we trigger this, you do not just get your pension back. You become the largest shareholder in Helios Capital. And Adrian, he becomes personally liable for that $250 million line of credit. I leaned back, feeling the weight of the years press down on me. He signed every page. He initialed every clause. His pride was always his weakness. Rebecca looked at me with something between admiration and fear. Most people dream of revenge. You built a mechanism for it and then waited 15 years. It was never about revenge, I corrected her. It was about survival. She studied me for a long time before nodding. Then her voice softened. You know, once we file this, there is no going back. I know. Outside the window, the city pulsed with its usual rhythm. Taxis honked, pedestrians hurried across crosswalks, skyscrapers glimmered in the midday sun. None of them knew that a single contract, a page buried in legalese, was about to topple a giant. Rebecca pushed a stack of documents toward me. We will need to notify Meridian Trust. Once they receive the termination notice and the clause, the transfer executes automatically. Digital processing, overnight. By morning, 12% of Helios is yours. I signed where she indicated, my pen stroke steady. Years of calculating risk had trained my hand not to waver. After the papers were sealed, I stared at the polished table, and memory dragged me backward to the fall of 2008. The trading floor had been a battlefield then, screens bleeding red, phones screaming, men with ties loosened and eyes hollow from fear. I had not left my desk for 4 straight days. Adrian had clutched my arm until it bruised, begging me to design models that could save the firm. I had done it. I had rebuilt the portfolio, renegotiated terms, even convinced the Federal Reserve to extend us lifelines. He had walked away with a $50 million bonus. I had received a plaque. That was the day I stopped believing loyalty was a two-way street. Rebecca left to brief her team, and I stayed behind in the glass room, alone with the city and the weight of my decision. I opened my notebook and began to build the record. Time, sender, subject, exact words used. I copied the headers from the email, the message ID, the route it took across our servers. I screenshotted the CC field with the regulator address. I listed every internal policy that the message violated. Documentation is not drama. It is gravity. It keeps the truth from floating away when people start shouting. I drafted a timeline from memory and then checked it against my calendar. The night the risk committee was pushed to a late slot and then canceled. The morning Adrian announced strategic recalibration. The weak bonuses were quietly adjusted for executives, while pension accruals for rank and file were frozen pending review. I did not need a smoking gun yet. Patterns are often enough. My phone buzzed with a message from a number that used to call me only for celebrations. A board member who had been slowly boxed out by Adrian. Saw your name in an alert. If you need a human spine in the room, say the word. No greeting, no signature. That was better. Names can be traced. Intent is harder to erase. I left the building and walked into the bright noon heat. The city smelled like summer and ambition. A street vendor handed a coffee to a nurse on her break. A courier whistled while weaving through taxis. Life did not pause for corporate wars. It never has. I crossed the avenue and turned into a quieter block lined with plane trees whose leaves trembled in the light wind. My husband once told me that New York has two tempos, one for the public stage and one just half a step behind it for those who know where the quiet corridors are. Today, I moved in that second rhythm. Back at home, I found the apartment still. My daughter had texted a heart and a question mark. I sent back a simple line. I am fine. Dinner at 7. When she was little, she thought the city would stop if I did not go into the office. Later, she learned the opposite. The city never stops. People do. I turned on my monitor wall and set a grid of feeds. The market wire. The employee chat channels our compliance team archives. The public relations dashboard. The Helios intranet. A small security camera view of my office at work, where a cleaning crew was moving like gray fish along a reef of desks. Calm on the surface, but the data streams told a different story. Someone in finance had already pulled a late-night meeting for emergency liquidity. Someone in legal had searched for bylaw amendment logs and left the window open long enough for the tracker to capture it. Someone in HR had asked for a template on layoffs and then been warned by systems to stop using keywords without approvals. Fear leaves fingerprints. I called my daughter into the living room when she got home. She stood in the doorway with her backpack still on, reading my face the way surgical nurses read vitals. I am going to be home for dinner, I said. She raised an eyebrow. That was not your answer. I smiled and softened my voice. I am going to fix something that should never have been broken. It might be loud for a while. She nodded. Do you need anything? Only patience. She set her bag down and went to help me chop vegetables. We worked in quiet sync like we had practiced for years. My mind kept writing lists while my hands moved. After dinner, I kissed her head and went back to the war room. Midnight was my threshold. Meridian Trust processed batch notifications at 1 in the morning. If we filed before 5, their system moved the request into the overnight queue. I wanted my message waiting at the very top. The portal required multi-factor authentication and a physical token. Rebecca had the token. We had arranged a courier handoff with old-fashioned caution. The token arrived in a plain envelope tucked between two trade journals. I held it like a relic and slotted it into the dock. The upload screen blinked. I attached the certified copy of the bylaw amendment. I attached the pension termination notice. I attached my affidavit with a line that tasted like iron on my tongue. The triggering condition has occurred. I request immediate execution of the equity conversion per Section 19, page 47. Before I hit submit, I paused. Silence filled the room like water. Fear tried to negotiate. Maybe wait one more day, maybe give them a chance to correct the error. But it was not an error. It was a decision made by people who assumed I would not fight because I had spent years building their scaffolds. I pressed submit. The window refreshed. A confirmation number appeared. Transfer initiated. Pending verification. I leaned back and let the chair hold me. The first domino had tipped. On my left screen, the employee chat channels were beginning to spark. Has anyone seen the intraday cash report? Why is Treasury locked? Did anyone else notice the SEC in the CC of a pension notice? There it was again. The first breadcrumb that had told me someone wanted me to act, maybe an ally in compliance, maybe a rival waiting to watch a king fall. Motives did not matter, only momentum. At 1:30 in the morning, the second system message arrived. Corporate reserve shares allocated, awaiting human verification. I rubbed my eyes and stood up to stretch. In the hallway, the night lights threw a pale ribbon along the floorboards. My husband found me there with a glass of water. He did not ask for a status update. He simply offered a palm, and I set my forehead against it for a long breath. What do you need? He asked. Stay awake with me until dawn, I said. He nodded. Of course. By 3, the city had gone quiet in that particular way that is never quite silence. Somewhere a truck shifted gears. Somewhere a siren rose and fell, then faded. The third message came at 5:23. Transfer complete. 11.8% of Helios common shares now registered to Willow Barnes. Voting rights active. I stared at the line until the letters steadied into meaning. It was done. The weapon I planted in a storm 15 years ago had bloomed right on schedule. I opened a new file and titled it simply Morning. At 8, I would walk into the building not as a servant, but as an owner. The board would try to pretend the theater could continue. Adrian would try to charm or threaten or both. I would carry none of it. Page 47 had changed the geometry of the room. There is a purity in leverage when it is used to restore what was stolen. It clears the air. I showered, dressed in a navy dress that fitted like a sentence with a full stop, and tied my hair back. No jewelry except a small watch. I left my keycard on the dresser and took the temporary badge that facilities had never deactivated after my last offsite. Small oversights sink big ships. In the elevator to the lobby, I checked my phone. Messages from current and former directors stacked like cards. You have my vote. Tell me where to stand. It is time. Rebecca texted a single line. Silverstone called. They want an emergency session with the company this afternoon. They have seen the ownership change. They have done the math on Adrian. I felt neither triumph nor fear, only alignment. Things were moving along the rails they were always going to follow. I stepped into the street and turned toward Helios, a tall glass blade cutting the morning sky. For years I had climbed this tower thinking the view was the point. Today I understood. The point was the foundation and the promise to those who hold it up. The guards at the security desk knew my face and my cadence. Habit makes patterns in the people who keep watch. One of them straightened when he saw me, and the wrinkle at the corner of his eyes said he had read the news alerts. Good morning, MS Barnes. He did not ask for my badge. He gestured to the private elevator, and I thanked him by name. Respect is a currency I never spent lightly. It always returns interest. On the 40th floor, the air had changed. The reception area hummed with contained panic. Assistants spoke in low voices. A cluster of senior managers leaned over a tablet with the look of people reading a forecast they could not afford to be true. Through the glass of the main conference room, I could see seats filling for an emergency board session. Adrian's assistant found me before I could step toward the door. Mr. Cross would like to see you in his office. Urgent. Of course it is urgent when the tide turns, I said. She hesitated. He asked for 10 minutes. He can have 9, I said. Old habits die hard. Adrian's office had been remodeled 3 times in 5 years. Every version tried to convince the visitor that permanence could be purchased. The current iteration wore dark wood and soft leathers like armor. He stood when I entered, eyes rimmed in red, tie slightly askew. He attempted a smile that never reached his eyes. Willow, thank you for coming. He gestured toward the chairs in front of his desk. I remained standing. He started to explain the suspension. Temporary, market headwinds. Responsible stewardship. The words lined up and fell over like cardboard soldiers. I let him finish and then set my phone on the desk where he could see the record light. No quotations, no theater, just the facts. I asked him why the SEC had been copied. He blamed a glitch. I pressed play on a recording from years ago, a board session from the time of the crisis where he had praised the amendments he had not read. He flinched when he heard his own voice. I do not want your chair, I said. I want my pension and the promise kept to everyone who earned theirs. I want a firm that measures success without stealing from the people who built it. He tried to pivot. We can restore your benefits. We can make you whole. His eyes flicked to the window and back, calculating the angle that would work on me. The angle no longer existed. The desk phone buzzed. His assistant spoke in a tone that tried to be steady and was not. Silverstone is here. They insist on speaking with you now. I watched the understanding land on his face. His personal guarantees. The credit covenant triggered by a change in control. The houses and the yacht and the art that had functioned as an extension of his name. All of it now the subject of a banker's checklist. I turned to leave. Your 9 minutes are up, I said. The hallway outside his office had filled with a pressure you could feel on the skin. Word travels through buildings like wind under doors. People smiled without showing teeth and kept moving. In the glass conference room, the directors settled into their positions. Some pretended neutrality. A few allowed relief to show, thin as a blade. The lead independent director invited me to speak. I stood, not at the head of the table, but at the side, where people who do the work in silence choose to stand. As of 5:23 this morning, I said, I became the largest individual shareholder of Helios Capital. The transfer executed automatically under Section 19 of the bylaws, page 47, triggered by the unilateral termination of my vested pension. The language is unambiguous and self-executing. The board approved it in the wake of the crisis. The signature page appeared on the screen behind me. Even from across the room, Adrian's signature had a flourish that now looked like a confession. One director tried to raise the question of intent. I answered with the only frame that matters in governance. The text governs, the facts govern. Intent is a story we tell ourselves after the consequences arrive. Another director asked about cost. I clicked to a slide I had prepared at 3 a.m. while the city slept. The cost of restoring pensions with interest. The cost compared to the executive bonus pool. The cost compared to a run on our clients if headlines turned darker. The doors opened and the representatives from Silverstone entered. No raised voices, no drama, just the scent of strong coffee and finality. They informed the room that they were calling Adrian's personal guarantee. If he did not satisfy it within 48 hours, they would begin seizures. A murmur spread across the table. I could feel the temperature shift. Markets are, in the end, the sum of many nervous systems reacting to the same disturbance. I laid out my conditions. Restore all suspended pensions with 12% interest compounded from the date of suspension. Accept the resignation of the chief executive. Establish an employee protection fund seeded from the executive bonus pool to prevent any future attempt to balance losses on the backs of those who do not sit at this table. There was a pause that felt like a held breath before a dive. Elena, the director who had sent the spine message, spoke first. I move that we adopt the proposals. Another director seconded so quickly that the sound overlapped. Hands rose. The count was not close. In less than 10 minutes a reign ended and something else began. Not victory. That was not the word. Alignment again. The room had been forced to face the simple geometry of consequence. The board adjourned. People filed out, careful as cats walking past a broken glass. The interim chief executive, our patient and brilliant chief financial officer, walked toward me with the look of someone who had always been prepared but never sure she would be asked. Why me? Her eyes said. Because you remember what a balance sheet is for, my eyes answered. I will not seek a role, I said aloud. I will vote my conscience. I will hold you up when you do the hard right and push you when you are tempted by the easy wrong. She nodded once, and that was enough. Adrian passed close by on his way to a side room with the bankers. He looked smaller, as if the air had learned it no longer owed him space. He said, "This is not finished." I said nothing. Words are cheap when the ledger is already written. The afternoon light was sharp and white when I crossed into the adjacent conference suite. Rebecca had arranged for me to observe the Silverstone session through a one-way connection. I did not want to sit at the table with Adrian while his empire collapsed. I wanted to watch from the shadow, like a surgeon reviewing the monitors while others held the scalpel. Adrian sat hunched between his lawyers, his tie loosened, his hands restless on the table. The Silverstone delegation did not waste time. Their lead banker opened a folder and read from it as if announcing a verdict. Mr. Cross, you have pledged your personal assets against the corporate credit line. Due to the triggering of Section 19 and the change of control, those guarantees are now callable. The outstanding balance is $250 million, payable immediately. Adrian tried to object, his voice rising with the familiar cadence of charm he had used on clients and boards for decades. Market volatility, temporary liquidity issues, reputational risk. The bankers did not blink. One of them recited the numbers from his asset sheet. 80 million liquid. The rest locked in property and collections. Insufficient. One of his lawyers attempted a compromise. Offer the real estate as collateral, allow for orderly liquidation. The banker shook his head. Collateral is not cash. We require satisfaction of the covenant. But perhaps, he paused with a deliberate weight, there is an alternative. The alternative was brutal in its simplicity. Helios Capital could assume the guarantee if Adrian surrendered everything tied to the firm. His shares, his options, his influence. A clean excision. He would keep his houses, but nothing of the tower. I watched the fight leave his body like water draining from a vessel. Rage, denial, bargaining, each expression flitted across his face before settling into something that looked like defeat. He asked for an hour. They granted it. Even Mercy had a timer. Rebecca entered my viewing room. They coordinated this with you, I said. She smiled without answering. Sometimes silence is the clearest admission. I understood. Silverstone wanted Helios stable. Catherine Hayes, our new interim chief, wanted a clean slate. I wanted accountability. The arrangement served all three. When the hour ended, Adrian signed. His pen strokes were hurried. Uneven, the mirror image of the confident signature he had laid down on page 47 years earlier. With that ink, he severed himself from the company he had once ruled. I walked out into the late afternoon heat, the city shimmering with traffic and noise. My phone buzzed with news alerts. Helios Capital leadership change. CEO steps down amid pension scandal. Analysts predicting stabilization under new governance. Words written by strangers, but the geometry beneath them was mine. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with a simple plate of pasta. My husband poured wine, my daughter asked cautious questions about the headlines. I told her enough to let her know I was safe, not enough to crush her with the weight of adult treachery. She leaned her chin on her hands and said quietly, "I am proud of you, Mom, not because you won, because you fought." Later, as the city lights flickered on, I stepped onto the balcony. The air smelled of summer rain approaching. I thought of the long chain of choices that had brought me here. The sleepless nights in 2008, the careful drafting of clauses no one else bothered to read. The years of silence waiting, people call it foresight. I call it listening to the certainty that betrayal will come and building a bridge to the other side before it does. At dawn, Helios would open for business again. Different faces, different rules, but tonight I finally allowed myself to rest. Page 47 had served its purpose. The morning after Adrian signed away his crown, I woke in silence. For the first time in decades, there was no alarm, no rush to dress in black suits, no commuter shuffle to the towers of glass. The only sound was the kettle boiling in the kitchen. My husband handed me a mug, and for a moment it felt like any other morning. But then I opened my phone, and reality poured out. Helios Capital CEO ousted in shareholder revolt. The woman behind page 47. Analysts call Barnes the most dangerous woman on Wall Street. My face stared back from the screens, an image captured as I left the building the day before. Stern, unsmiling, caught mid-stride. They painted me as a warrior, a conspirator, a revolutionary. I was none of those things. I was a risk manager who had refused to be erased. By mid-morning, the calls began. Journalists, producers, hedge fund managers, even a senator's office. I ignored them all. I did not want to become a symbol. Symbols are consumed. I wanted to remain a person with a daughter who still needed me home for dinner and a husband who worked 12-hour shifts in an emergency ward. At 11, Rebecca called. "The board wants you in the building. Catherine Hayes is holding her first executive session as interim CEO. They need you there." I dressed carefully, not in armor but in intention. A simple blouse, a blazer the color of storm clouds. Hair tied back, no earrings, no necklace. The message was clear. I was not seeking a throne. When I entered the conference floor, the air was different. The frantic energy had settled into wary curiosity. People stared openly now, their whispers no longer hushed. I could feel their questions pressing against me like wind. Was I savior or executioner? Did I come for power or for justice? I let them wonder. Inside the boardroom, Catherine sat at the head, her posture steady but her hands clasped tightly. She was a competent woman who had been overlooked for years. Now she was the figure holding the weight. I admired her restraint. She welcomed me formally, her voice strong. "Willow, thank you for joining. The board has questions about your intentions as shareholder." I remained standing, hands resting lightly on the back of a chair. I have no desire for an executive role. I will not seek a board seat. I will vote my shares with conscience and transparency. My only conditions are those already approved yesterday: the restoration of pensions, the Employee Protection Fund, the resignation of Adrian Cross. Beyond that, my presence is as a guardian, not a ruler. Murmurs rippled around the table. Some directors looked relieved. Others looked suspicious. Power abhors a vacuum, and they expected me to seize what had fallen. The fact that I did not unsettled them more than if I had. One of Adrian's former allies, Thornton, leaned forward. "And what happens when your interests diverge from the company?" "Then you will see my vote cast openly," I said. "No secrets, no hidden games. You have lived long enough under shadow." Catherine gave me a small nod, gratitude mixed with determination. Then she shifted the agenda to the forensic audit. Teams had already begun combing through records. Early findings suggested irregularities beyond the pension theft. Adrian had treated retirement funds like a personal piggy bank, siphoning millions to cover trading losses, disguising the flows with derivatives that most people could not begin to decipher. The numbers hit the room like stones dropped into water. No one spoke for a long moment. Finally, Catherine said, "We will make every employee whole. It will take time, but we will do it." I watched the faces of the directors. Some turned pale, others tight with anger. A few showed calculation, already wondering how to distance themselves from the rot. They had all signed approvals. They had all looked the other way. Consequences were coming for more than Adrian. The session adjourned. As people filed out, Catherine caught my arm. "Thank you," she said quietly. "They would have torn me apart if you had walked away." I looked her in the eye. "Do not thank me yet. The war has only changed fronts." By afternoon, the counterpunch arrived. Not from the boardroom where courage is rare in daylight, but from the corridors where gossip reproduces faster than facts. An unsigned memo began to circulate on message boards and investor chats. It painted me as a saboteur who had engineered a hostile grab for years. The language had Adrian's rhythm even without his name. He always believed that a lie repeated at scale becomes a kind of fog. People cannot see through fog. They hesitate. Then came the legal shot. Rebecca forwarded a notice that Adrian's counsel had filed for a temporary restraining order to freeze the share transfer. I read the motion on my screen and felt a brief clean anger. They argued the clause was unconscionable. They argued the board never intended for it to be used. They argued that a provision hidden on page 47 should not outweigh business necessity. It was predictable, and it was late. Meridian held the escrow. The transfer was complete. A judge could debate the past. The shares were the present. The news channels warmed to the conflict. Analysts with tidy haircuts discussed whether I was a visionary in defense of workers or a danger to free markets. The word danger clung to me like a burr. No one had used it when Adrian diverted pension money. No one had called him dangerous when he pledged the company to cover his bets. But a woman who writes a clause and then uses it is a storm. I turned off the television and returned to work. The SEC requested an interview window. The message was formal, but there was a human note in the final line. "Your documentation has been helpful." I felt a small weight lift. When regulators move from suspicion to structure, the path becomes visible. Catherine texted to say her communications team needed guidance. Employees were frightened. Rumors of layoffs had detonated in the basement levels where fear always echoes the loudest. I reminded her of our first principle. Speak only the truth you can defend in a courtroom. Speak it early and in plain language. The rest we prove with actions. She replied with a simple understood. That word told me she had the spine for this. By evening, I finally stepped into a taxi headed home. The driver glanced back in the mirror as if he recognized me and then decided not to mention it. I thanked him when he unlocked the door and walked into the hush of the apartment. My daughter sat at the kitchen island with homework spread like a field across the granite. She hesitated before speaking. "A girl in my class said her father lost his bonus because of you." Her voice did not accuse. It weighed. I rinsed an apple and cut it into clean slices. The knife moved steady. "The truth is heavier than commentary," I said. I kept my tone soft and even. Some people lost bonuses because they were paid out of money that was not theirs. Some people will get their retirements back because we took the harder path. She nodded and chewed a slice slowly. Then she asked if I would still make the school play next week. I told her I would. I wrote it into my calendar as if ink could anchor it to time. After she went to bed, I stood by the window and watched the traffic slides of red and white across the avenue. I thought of my early years at Helios when I believed patience and competence would be shield enough. Back then, I arrived before sunrise and left after the cleaning crews, convinced that fidelity to the math would protect me from politics. I learned slowly that numbers can be bent until they scream, that budgets become narratives, that narratives become weapons. So I built a different kind of defense and hid it in a place where only discipline could find it. The next morning, the legal attempt failed with a brief order. The judge declined to unwind an executed transfer, citing the escrow and the clear language of the bylaw. Adrian's team pivoted to the press. Anonymous sources claimed I had misled the board in 2009. Those claims met a wall when someone released the recording of him praising the very amendments he claimed to misunderstand. I did not release it. I did not need to. In a storm like this, truth finds its own exit. I walked to the office under a sky the color of steel. On the corner, a newsstand had arranged 3 papers side by side. The words "most dangerous woman" sat above my photograph again. I wanted to laugh. I had saved this firm twice, once with models and once with a paragraph. Danger, it seemed, depended on whose hand held the pen. The first executive forum under Catherine felt different. She stood on the small stage set up in the auditorium and spoke without swagger. She did not promise painless days. She did not use the bright adjectives that melt under fluorescent lights. She said we are restoring pensions with interest. She said we are capping executive bonuses at a ratio that respects the lowest paid full-time employee. She said we will do this while remaining profitable because the math is possible when the story is honest. The room did not erupt. It exhaled. After the forum, I walked the floors without an entourage. People stopped pretending not to look at me. A junior analyst asked if her mother's suspended benefits would return. I said yes, and she cried quietly and tried to apologize for it. I told her not to. Relief is not weakness, it is a landing. Thornton cornered me near the elevators with a smile sharpened at the edges. He wanted to know my longer plan. He said investors were nervous that I was unpredictable. I told him I am the most predictable person in this building. I keep receipts. I read every page. I vote according to the numbers and the promises we have signed. He wanted theater. I gave him accounting. He moved on. On the compliance floor, a man left me a folded note with no name. I once believed loyalty was silence. I was wrong. If you need a timeline of who signed what, when the pension committee changed its charter, and who pushed the email to the regulator, tell me where to send it. I slipped the note into my pocket. The truth is a lattice. You climb it one knot at a time. In the afternoon, Rebecca and I sat with the SEC team on a secure video line. I stated facts and dates in steady succession. I did not guess. I did not shade. Where memory might betray me, I offered documents. Where the record was incomplete, I offered to locate it. One of the examiners asked the question that often sits quiet under the polite ones. Why did you document everything with such discipline for so many years? I answered without pause. Because I grew up in a place where promises were fragile, and the only way to keep them was to write them down and keep the paper dry. When the call ended, I felt the familiar fatigue that lives behind clarity. Rebecca rubbed her temple and smiled. They like you because you do not try to be liked. It was meant as a compliment. I let it pass without ceremony. Approval is not a strategy. Clean files are. The backlash arrived in subtler forms. A whisper that I had ruined a charity gala by refusing a photo with a donor. A rumor that I had blocked a promotion for someone I had never met. Small cuts meant to make me bleed time. I refused them oxygen. I refused them audience. I kept my calendar full of tasks that could be proven and signed. At home, my husband took a late shift, and the apartment felt too quiet. I made tea and sorted papers on the dining table. I found the first job offer I ever received from Helios, printed on thick cream stock the color of old ivory. I remembered the feeling of splitting open the envelope with a butter knife because I owned nothing sharp back then. The salary looked huge to the girl I was. The promises looked bigger. I tucked the letter back into its sleeve and felt a clean sadness for the years I had believed work and worth were the same word. The next day brought an unexpected call from a hospital board member who had read the headlines and decided that someone who could write a sentence that protected people might be useful in a different arena. I told him not now. I did not want a new tower before this one learned to stand without hurting the people at its base. He said he would call again in 6 months. I filed the possibility away like a spare key in the back of a drawer. Catherine sent me a preliminary audit memo in the evening. The numbers were worse than the rumors. 70 million rerouted over 5 years. Complex vehicles used to hide simple theft. I scrolled through tables and footnotes until the lines blurred. Then I stopped and stood on the balcony to let the air rinse my head. Somewhere downtown, Adrian's lawyers were still building their next argument. Somewhere uptown, employees were showing spouses the email that said benefits would be restored. Somewhere in the middle of the island, I chose to believe the second thing was stronger than the first. I slept briefly and woke before dawn, the city gray and tender. Part of me wanted to be done, to walk away and let the new management shoulder the rest. That part had the voice of a parent who wants quiet for the child to do homework. Another part of me said not yet. There would be a vote ahead to enshrine protections into the charter so that no future executive could pretend not to read the page that saves people. I brewed coffee and opened a blank document. Title: Charter Amendment Draft. First line: Pension protections are permanent and self-executing. Second line: Board cannot waive without a supermajority of shareholders. Third line: No executive compensation plan may be approved in any year where the pension fund is not fully funded. The language built itself with patient wait. I wrote until the light shifted gold. The flare came on a Thursday afternoon. I was reviewing Catherine's draft budget when Rebecca called with a tone that told me she would rather have stayed silent. Adrian had signed with a publisher. A book deal. The working title was already circulating: The Page 47 Conspiracy. He was going to paint himself as the betrayed visionary, the victim of a scheming subordinate who hid poison in contracts. I laughed, an honest sound that startled even me. Let him write it, I said. Let him explain how he signed every page without reading. Let him tell the world he pledged his assets blindly. His story will be fiction shelved in business. Rebecca exhaled. You understand this will feed his followers. The narrative of betrayal is powerful. So is the record, I answered. And I have the record. The next morning, his lawyers tried another angle. They leaked selective emails, fragments out of context, lines meant to suggest collusion. Within hours, a compliance officer who had grown tired of silence released the full threads. The fragments dissolved like sugar in hot water. Truth has a strange way of finding its own acceleration once the dam breaks. Still, I could feel the wear. Headlines bent my name into shapes I did not recognize. My daughter came home from school with a folded newspaper where my face sat above a column titled "The Woman Who Waited Too Long to Strike." She placed it on the counter without speaking. I put it straight into the recycling. Some paper belongs there. That weekend, I took her to the park. We walked under the trees, and she asked why I kept fighting when I already had won. I stopped and looked at her, really looked. She had his eyes, the shade of storm water, but my stillness. Because winning once does not change the structure, I said. We have to build something that lasts when the noise dies down. Otherwise, someone else will try again. She was quiet for a while, then said, So you are making rules so I will not have to fight like this when I am older. I nodded. She slipped her hand into mine. The simplicity of her gesture steadied me more than any market rally ever had. On Monday, Catherine convened a board session to review the charter amendment I had drafted. Some directors protested the rigidity. One argued that tying executive bonuses to pension funding would scare away top talent. I told him if top talent requires stealing from retirees to stay, then it is not talent, it is theft with a better wardrobe. Silence followed. Votes followed. The amendment passed to shareholder review. The SEC called again that evening. They wanted me in Washington for testimony. The voice on the line said formally that my documentation had accelerated their case. Informally, he added that what I had done was rare. Most people calculate the risk of speaking up and remain silent. You calculated the risk of silence, he said, and chose the other path. I closed the call and sat at my desk. The city pulsed outside, indifferent to my victories and my scars. I thought of Adrian, now reduced to sound bites and lawyers' bills, and wondered if he ever truly understood what page 47 was. It was not a trap. It was a mirror. It showed who he was when he chose greed over loyalty. That night, as I set my daughter's textbooks in a neat stack for the morning, she asked one last question. Do you regret it? I touched the folder where the original amendment still lay, the ink dark and steady. No, I said. I regret only that it was necessary. When she went to bed, I stepped onto the balcony. The air was cool, the lights of the city stretched like constellations written by architects. I realized I was no longer waiting for the next blow. I was setting the stage for something else, something steadier. Not revenge, not even justice. Structure. Tomorrow would bring subpoenas, meetings, headlines, distortions. But tonight I allowed myself to believe that preparation had meaning, that words written carefully could outlast the people who signed them carelessly. And in that belief, I finally felt what I had been chasing for years, through numbers and contracts and sleepless nights. I felt free. The train to Washington hummed like a low heartbeat beneath my seat. I had chosen the quiet car, a small island where phones stayed muted and conversations never rose above a whisper. Outside the window, the Jersey marshes stretched flat and gray, broken only by bridges and the occasional glint of water. I carried no entourage, only a slim leather folder with the documents I had already sent 100 times. Originals are not necessary in an age of scanners and digital seals, but I wanted the weight in my hands. Paper has gravity. It reminds you the words are real. The SEC headquarters was all glass and steel, another monument to bureaucracy disguised as transparency. I checked in, passed through security, and followed an aide to a conference room that smelled faintly of coffee and toner. 4 officials sat at the long table, their faces neutral but their eyes bright with intent. Deputy Director Harrison opened with formal gratitude. Your documentation has been critical to our investigation. We will need you to confirm the timeline under oath. I nodded, unbuttoned my jacket, and sat. My voice did not rise or falter as I recited dates, emails, board minutes, and signatures. They asked why I had kept such meticulous records. I gave the same answer I had given before, because betrayal is not an if. It is a when. and the only protection is paper. Hours passed in a rhythm of questions and answers. I refused speculation. I offered only what I could prove. When they asked about Adrian's role, I did not gild it with anger. I said plainly that he authorized changes, signed off on reports, initialed every page. I did not need to add adjectives. His actions were their own verdict. When the session ended, one of the younger examiners lingered. She waited until the others had left before leaning slightly forward. My father lost his pension in a smaller firm. He never recovered. What you did, it matters more than you know. I thanked her, though the words felt too small. Gratitude is easy. Bearing the consequences is heavier. Back in New York, the forensic audit continued to unravel. Catherine called me one night with a voice that was both triumphant and horrified. 73 million misappropriated from pension accounts over 5 years, she said. He covered it with derivatives that collapsed in hours under our review. He left fingerprints everywhere. I stared at the numbers on my screen. It was worse than we thought, but not worse than I expected. Adrian always believed complexity could hide intent, but math is patient. It waits until someone bothers to check. The news channels devoured the findings. Headlines screamed of betrayal, fraud, collapse. For once, the outrage was not at me, but at the man who had built his fortune on other people's futures. Employees who had once looked at me with suspicion now sent thank you notes, sometimes typed, sometimes handwritten in shaky cursive. I saved everyone, not as trophies, as reminders that people still believe in fairness when they see it made real. One afternoon, I walked past the cafeteria and saw something that almost made me stop breathing. The security guard who had worked the front desk for decades was sitting with 2 young analysts. He was telling them his pension had been restored with interest. They clapped for him, unembarrassed. He smiled the smile of a man who had carried worry for too long and finally set it down. I turned away before he saw me. That moment belonged to him, not to me. Adrian's unraveling did not come as a sudden collapse. It came in stages, each one stripping another layer of armor he had built for himself over decades. The first was financial. Silverstone moved quickly, seizing accounts, freezing transfers, filing liens on his estates. The Hampton house appeared on the market within days, the glossy photographs of manicured lawns and ocean views now bait for strangers' wallets. His yacht was impounded in Miami. His art collection disappeared into the custody of a secured warehouse. The second stage was reputational. Magazines that once lauded him as a visionary now called him reckless. Former allies stepped away in orchestrated silence. Invitations to charity galas evaporated. His name, once shorthand for power, had become a punchline whispered at cocktail hours. The third stage was legal. Prosecutors filed charges based on the audit findings. Wire fraud, misappropriation of funds, breach of fiduciary duty. The list grew by the week. Cameras caught him entering the courthouse, his once perfect posture bent slightly, his hair less polished, his eyes darting with calculation that no longer landed. Through it all, I remained silent. I refused interviews, declined panels, ignored publishers. The louder his camp screamed conspiracy, the quieter I became. Silence is not weakness. Silence is oxygen deprivation to those who thrive on noise. Still, the toll pressed against me. Nights grew shorter, sleep fractured by sudden wakefulness. I would jolt up at 3 a.m, convinced I had forgotten a file, only to find the folders stacked neatly where I had left them. My husband found me one dawn staring at the city with a glass of water in my hand. "You do not have to carry all of it," he said softly. I wanted to believe him, but I knew I did. At least until the last signature was filed, the last pension restored. My daughter noticed too. She studied me with the sharp eyes of someone who understands that adults lie when they say they are fine. One evening she sat at the table, her homework pushed aside, and asked if this fight would ever end. I told her the truth. Fights like these do not end. They transform. We win a battle, we write a rule, and then someone tries to bend it. Our job is to be ready when they do. She nodded, then smiled faintly. So I should keep studying law. I laughed for the first time in days. Yes. Study it until you can tear down every excuse men like Adrian build for themselves. The next week, the SEC called again. They had enough evidence to move forward with a sweeping case, not just against Adrian, but against others who had copied his scheme across different firms. They asked if I would testify publicly. I hesitated. The thought of standing in front of cameras, my words dissected by pundits and trolls, filled me with a weariness heavier than fear. But then I remembered the guard in the cafeteria, his restored pension, his relieved smile. I agreed. The day of testimony, the chamber was packed. Journalists scribbled, cameras clicked, the air tense with expectation. When my turn came, I stood, hand raised, and swore to tell the truth. My voice carried evenly across the room as I laid out the facts. No embellishment, no drama. Just the chain of documents, the signatures, the flows of money. I described how page 47 had been written, how it was triggered, how it revealed the theft. When I finished, the room was silent for a long moment. Then questions began, sharp and relentless, but I stayed steady. I knew the answers. I had lived them. That night, back in my apartment, I set my phone on the table and did not pick it up again. My daughter hugged me, my husband poured wine, and for a brief hour we allowed ourselves to exist as a family unburdened by headlines. The city outside kept moving, but inside our walls, stillness felt like victory. Adrian's final collapse arrived not with an explosion but with a whisper. His lawyers negotiated a plea agreement, trading prison years for cooperation. He admitted to misappropriating funds, to falsifying records, to signing guarantees he never intended to honor. The man who once ruled an empire reduced himself to a line item in a prosecutor's press release. I read the statement twice. It felt smaller than the damage he had caused, like a bandage on a fracture. But justice is rarely clean. It is a ledger, and sometimes all you can do is make the columns add up enough to prove the pattern. Inside Helios, a transformation began. Catherine announced new guardrails, codifying pension protections into the charter. Executive bonuses tied directly to funding ratios. Transparent reporting to employees, not just to directors. The reforms were not glamorous, but they were real. I attended the shareholder vote, cast my shares in favor, and watched the amendment pass with overwhelming support. For the first time in years, applause broke out in the boardroom. Not polite claps, genuine relief. Employees began to stop me in the hallways. Some thanked me in hurried whispers. Others simply met my eyes and nodded. One woman left a handwritten note on my desk that said only, "I can sleep again." Those 5 words carried more weight than any analyst's report. Yet I felt the edges of exhaustion sharpening. The hearings, the scrutiny, the endless speculation about my motives had drained something that coffee and discipline could not restore. At night, I caught myself staring at the ceiling, counting the years I had given to this tower, wondering how many more I owed. My husband asked one evening over dinner, "When is it enough?" His tone was not impatient. It was kind, but insistent. "You have built the fire break. You have shown them the cost of betrayal. Maybe it is time to let others carry the hose." I swirled the wine in my glass, watching the liquid catch the light. I thought of the girl I once was, opening her first job offer, convinced loyalty would be repaid. I thought of the woman I had become, carving survival into a contract line that no one else had cared to read. Both of them still lived inside me, and both were tired. The following week, Catherine invited me to her office. She closed the door and spoke plainly. "Willow, we need you, but not in the way people think. You do not need to stand in every meeting or answer every headline. What we need is your presence as a shareholder, your vote when it matters, your guidance when the law grows dense. You have already carried more than anyone should." Her words landed like a release. She was telling me that stepping back was not abandonment. It was trust. Trust that the structure we had built could hold without my constant weight. I left her office and walked slowly through the lobby, past the guards, past the glass doors that had once felt like gates. Outside, the city roared with traffic and voices. For the first time in months, I felt the air not as resistance but as space. The decision came quietly, without ceremony. One morning, I woke before sunrise and realized I did not need to go to the tower. The board would meet, the auditors would work, Catherine would lead. And for once, the outcome did not depend on me sitting in the room. I brewed coffee and stood on the balcony as the city lit itself awake. The streets below filled with delivery trucks, cyclists, commuters, ordinary motion. I felt my shoulders loosen, as if some invisible rope had been cut. That afternoon, I drafted a letter to the board. Not a resignation, there was nothing to resign from. I remained a shareholder, but I declared my intention to withdraw from day-to-day involvement. I wrote that my role had never been about power, only protection. That the protections were now law, and law is stronger than any single person. The letter was brief, 4 paragraphs, but I rewrote it 5 times. Words matter, they outlast intentions. When I finished, I printed a copy and handed it to Catherine in person. She read it slowly, folded it once, and placed it in her drawer. She did not argue. She only reached out, clasped my hand, and said, "Thank you, not for me, for them." I left the building and walked the length of the avenue without looking back. The skyscraper shimmered in the late sun, tall and sharp as ever, but it no longer held me. At home, my daughter was rehearsing lines for her school play. She asked if I could help her memorize. I sat on the couch and listened to her recite, prompting when she stumbled, praising when she soared. For an hour, there were no pensions, no audits, no contracts. Just a girl learning the rhythm of words and a mother marveling at the sound. That night, after she went to bed, I opened the original folder one last time. Page 47 stared up at me, steady and unchanging. I traced the ink with my finger and then slid the page back into its sleeve. I locked the folder away, not as a weapon waiting, but as a relic of what had been survived. As I turned out the light, I felt something I had not in years. Not triumph, not vengeance, not even justice. Peace. The war was not over, not in the world. There would always be another Adrian somewhere, another betrayal dressed in expensive suits. But here, in this chapter, it was finished. And for the first time, I allowed myself to rest. The first Monday I did not walk into Helios, I walked into a classroom. A lecture hall at Columbia, bright with morning light, rows of students rustling with laptops and coffee cups. I had been invited to guest lecture on corporate governance, a subject that usually sent eyes glazing over. But this time the seats were full, even the stairs lined with bodies. Curiosity had drawn them here, the woman from page 47. I set my folder on the desk and looked at the sea of young faces. They expected drama, revelation, maybe even gossip. I gave them arithmetic. Governance is not about power, I said. It is about protection. It is not glamorous. It is not fast. It is words on paper, written carefully, enforced consistently. Every clause you ignore is a risk. Every promise you fail to record is an opening for betrayal. They typed quickly, some nodding, some frowning as if they wanted something spicier. I let them stew in the simplicity. Then I told them the story of a pension clause hidden on page 47, not as a legend, but as a case study. I showed them how discipline written in plain language could hold against arrogance wrapped in wealth. When the lecture ended, students lined up with questions. Some asked about careers, some about ethics. One young woman waited until the end and asked quietly, "Do you regret writing it?" I thought carefully before answering. "I regret that it was necessary," I said, "but I do not regret protecting people who had no other shield." She nodded, and I saw in her eyes the same fire I had carried for decades. Perhaps she would plant her own clause one day. Walking back across campus, I felt lighter than I had in years. Teaching did not drain me. It steadied me. Perhaps that was the next chapter. At home, my daughter sprawled across the couch with textbooks. She asked how it went. I told her the students were sharp, restless, impatient to change the world. She smirked. "Sounds like me." "Yes," I said, "and that is why I want you to see that change comes not only from shouting, but from writing, signing, and holding the line." She rolled her eyes but smiled. That evening, as the city lights sparked on, I realized something important. For the first time in months, the headlines did not matter. Adrian's name was fading from the news. Helios was stabilizing under Catherine. My phone buzzed with fewer calls. The noise had receded, leaving space for something quieter, something mine. Invitations multiplied once the lecture spread online. Universities wanted panels. Law schools wanted seminars. Nonprofits wanted keynotes about ethics in finance. My inbox filled with polite requests wrapped in urgent tones. Some offered honorariums that made me laugh. Others promised prestige. I answered only a few. The rest I let drift unanswered, like leaves on a current I no longer needed to chase. One evening, Rebecca came by with a bottle of wine. She still carried her lawyer's urgency, even off duty. "You could sit on 5 boards tomorrow if you wanted," she said. "Hospitals, universities, even a renewable energy startup. They all want the credibility you bring." I poured her a glass and shook my head. "I am not sure credibility should be for sale." She studied me across the rim of her glass. "It is not about selling. It is about building. But you have to decide if you want to build again." Her words lingered long after she left. Build again. The phrase echoed like both invitation and threat. That week, I met with a group of young lawyers who had formed a clinic for workers cheated out of pensions and severance. They asked if I would mentor them, not for money, only for guidance. I agreed. Their office was small, just a converted loft with folding chairs and second-hand desks. But the energy inside was electric. They were clumsy with strategy but fierce with intent. Watching them reminded me of my own early years, before cynicism carved grooves in my thinking. I taught them the basics: documentation, timelines, chain of custody for evidence. The unglamorous bricks that build a case strong enough to withstand corporate artillery. They listened, scribbled notes, argued among themselves, and then thanked me with sincerity that felt heavier than any board invitation. On the subway home, I realized I was smiling. Not the thin, polite smile I had worn in boardrooms. A real one. Perhaps my future was not in towers of glass, but in small rooms with young people stubborn enough to believe the world could be better if you wrote the rules tightly enough. At dinner, my daughter announced that her civics teacher had asked her to give a short talk about ethics in finance. She groaned, saying she did not want to be known as the daughter of page 47. I told her she could simply speak about fairness, about promises kept or broken. She nodded slowly, then said, "Maybe I will tell them that contracts are like math. If you skip a line, the whole equation falls apart." I laughed. She had been listening more than she admitted. That night, as I washed dishes, I thought again about Rebecca's words. Build again. Maybe she was right, but maybe building did not mean another Helios. Maybe it meant building people, students, clinics, structures that outlasted headlines. Temptation always arrives dressed in opportunity. The first call came from a private equity firm, cloaked in charm. They praised my foresight, my discipline, my supposed genius for seeing what no one else could. Then they dangled a seat on their advisory board with compensation large enough to pay for a lifetime of luxuries. I declined before they finished the pitch. I had no desire to be a mascot for the very machine I had just dismantled. The second call came from a senator's office. They spoke of reform, of hearings, of a national task force on corporate accountability. The voice on the line hinted at future campaigns, even a run for office. I listened politely, then said I had already testified under oath. That was contribution enough. Politics, I told them, was a theater where the script changes daily. I had spent too long writing sentences that survived storms to return to improvisation. Still, each offer tugged at me in different ways. The idea of influence was seductive. Influence could protect more people. Influence could scale fairness beyond one firm, but I had learned the price of influence. It devours time, sleep, family, and sometimes the soul. One evening I sat on the balcony with my husband, the city spread beneath us in lights. He asked what troubled me. I told him about the calls, the offers, the pressure to step back into the spotlight. He listened, then said something simple. The world will always want more from you. The question is what you want from the world. I turned his words over in my head for days. What did I want? Not applause, not money, not titles. I wanted my daughter to grow up in a place where promises meant something. I wanted young lawyers to fight cases armed with solid sentences, not slogans. I wanted to walk through the city without feeling the weight of skyscrapers pressing expectation onto my shoulders. At the mentorship clinic, one of the students asked if I missed the adrenaline of Helios. I surprised myself by answering immediately. No, adrenaline is not purpose. It is the body's way of paying rent when you have stayed too long in danger. I do not miss it. What I miss is clarity, the kind that comes when you know you are protecting something worth every bruise. The student smiled and said quietly, "Then maybe that is what you are doing here." On the train ride home, I stared at the reflection of my face in the dark window. For years, that reflection had belonged to someone armored, calculated, relentless. Now it belonged to someone searching for gentler definitions of strength. The conclusion arrived not in a flash of revelation, but in the small rhythms of daily life. I woke one morning to the sound of my daughter humming as she packed her school bag. The melody drifted through the apartment, soft and careless. It struck me then that this was what survival was for, not to win endless battles, but to create a space where someone you love can hum without fear. That afternoon, I walked back into Columbia for another lecture. The room was full again, not because of headlines now, but because the first students had told others. They came with notebooks, not cameras. They wanted to learn, not to consume a scandal. I spoke about structure, about writing rules that could hold long after you are gone. I showed them how a single page buried in a contract could shift an empire. But I also told them about the cost, the years of silence, the strain on family, the weight of always waiting for betrayal. Their faces grew serious, and I saw them absorbing not just the technique but the truth that courage is expensive. When the lecture ended, one student asked what I would do next. I smiled and said, "I will keep teaching until you no longer need me." Because if I have done this right, the next time someone tries to betray the people who built the foundation, it will not take 15 years for the reckoning. It will take 15 minutes. They applauded not for me but for the idea. And that was enough. Walking across campus, I felt the spring air on my face. I realized I no longer carried the weight of the tower. I carried something else now, a responsibility to pass the torch, to shape others into guardians of promises. That burden was lighter. did not devour, it sustained. At home that evening, my daughter asked if I would be there for her next rehearsal. I told her yes without hesitation. The look on her face was worth more than any board seat, any invitation, any headline. Later, as the city darkened into constellations of light, I pulled out the folder one last time. I slipped page 47 into a fireproof box, not as a weapon waiting to be used, but as a teaching tool. A story for students, a reminder for myself. Proof that foresight and patience could outlast greed, I closed the box and set it on the shelf. For the first time in decades, I felt no need to check it again. My war with Helios was over. My work with the next generation had begun. Peace, I thought, is not the absence of conflict. It is the presence of purpose. And at last, I had found mine. Legacy has a way of growing without permission. Months after I stepped back, newspapers began reporting on companies quietly amending their charters. Pension protections were being written into bylaws across the industry. Some copied page 47 word for word. Others adapted it, making their own clauses stronger, faster, sharper. Commentators called it the Barnes Clause. I had not asked for the name, but it followed me like a shadow. At the mentorship clinic, the young lawyers brought me articles with wide eyes. They were thrilled, convinced that we had sparked a movement. I smiled, but inside I felt unease. Movements are fragile. They swell with hope but falter when tested. And every clause, no matter how clever, is only as strong as the people willing to enforce it. Then came the call from Geneva. An international finance consortium wanted me to keynote their annual summit. They promised an audience of ministers, regulators, CEOs. My first instinct was to refuse. I had sworn off stages lit for spectacle, but my mentees urged me. If you do not speak, they will water it down. They will turn your clause into a footnote. I wrestled with the decision for weeks. In the quiet of night, I replayed the hearings, the boardroom battles, the toll it had taken. Was I willing to step back into the noise? My husband reminded me gently that legacy is not only what you leave behind, but what others do with it when you are gone. So I boarded a plane. Geneva greeted me with cold air and mountains sharp against the sky. The summit hall glittered with chandeliers and accents from every continent. Men in tailored suits and women in polished heels clustered in knots, their badges heavy with titles. I felt the familiar tug of adrenaline, the old itch to armor myself. But I had promised myself peace. When my turn came, I walked onto the stage with no slides, no theatrics. Only words. Page 47 was never about me, I began. It was about the janitor who cleaned our offices at night, the analyst who stayed late fixing broken models, the receptionist who smiled at every client. It was about people who gave their lives to a company and deserved to walk away with dignity. If you are here to debate whether that dignity is negotiable, then you are not debating governance. You are debating humanity. The hall was silent. I let the silence stretch, heavy and uncomfortable. Then I told them the story, not the headlines, not the scandals, but the math. Pension theft disguised as derivatives. Bonuses carved from futures. The clause that forced the scales to balance. When I finished, there was no applause at first. Then slowly it came, reluctant in some corners, fierce in others. I walked off the stage and felt no triumph, only relief that the words had landed where they needed to. Back in New York, my daughter met me at the airport. She asked if I had changed the world. I told her no, I had only written one page. The rest was up to those who came after. The scandal broke 3 weeks after Geneva. A multinational shipping conglomerate had quietly siphoned pension contributions into offshore accounts. The numbers were staggering, hundreds of millions diverted, thousands of workers across 5 countries left facing empty futures. The headlines were brutal. The board claimed the maneuver was legal under local statutes. Legal, they repeated, as if legality were the same as morality. At the clinic, my mentees erupted. They printed the articles, highlighted sections, drew frantic arrows across whiteboards. They wanted to file amicus briefs, launch petitions, call regulators in 6 jurisdictions. Their voices overlapped, each more determined than the last. They turned to me, waiting for me to lead. The old instinct flickered inside me, the familiar pull to sharpen documents into weapons, to step onto another battlefield. For a moment I considered it. Then I looked around the room. Their eyes burned with the same fire I had once carried. This was their fight to take, not mine to steal. I raised my hand and the room fell quiet. You do not need me to swing the hammer, I told them. You need me to show you how to build one that does not break in your hands, so I taught them. Not strategy in grand strokes, but the mechanics that matter. How to trace money through shell companies. How to compare regulatory filings across borders. how to write affidavits that survive scrutiny in any courtroom. I showed them where to look for the footnotes executives hope no one will read. They worked through the night, fueled by cheap takeout and the raw energy of purpose. I stayed until midnight, then left them with stacks of templates and the quiet instruction: protect each other. Betrayal is inevitable, so is resistance. At home, I sat on the balcony and breathed in the city air, heavy with spring rain. My husband joined me, setting 2 mugs of tea on the table. "You wanted peace," he said gently. I smiled tiredly. Maybe peace is not the absence of battles. Maybe it is knowing which ones belong to you and which belong to those who come after. He nodded, as if he had known all along I would reach that conclusion. The next morning, I opened the newspaper and saw a headline: Young Legal Team Challenges Shipping Giant Using Barnes Clause Framework. My name again, tied to a fight I had not entered but had shaped. For the first time, I felt no irritation at the shadow of legacy. Instead, I felt something steadier: continuity. Their first victory was small, almost invisible in the scale of billions, but it mattered. A regional court in Rotterdam froze part of the shipping company's assets, citing the risk of irreparable harm to employees. The injunction was narrow, temporary, fragile. Yet when the news reached the clinic, the room erupted. Cheers, hugs, tears. They celebrated not because the war was won, but because they had proven the fight could be waged. I stood at the back, unnoticed for a moment, watching them. Their energy filled the air like electricity. I remembered my own first win, years ago, in a dusty arbitration room where no one clapped, where victory meant only that numbers stopped bleeding. I had carried the weight alone back then. These young lawyers carried it together, and the difference showed in their faces. One of them finally saw me and called out, "Willow, we did it. Come join us." I smiled but shook my head. "This is yours, do not give the credit away." They nodded reluctantly, but I saw the gratitude in their eyes. They understood what I meant. Later that night, walking home under a sky blurred with city lights, I felt a strange ache. Not sadness, not pride, but something between. Letting go is heavier than holding on. It requires faith that others will keep walking when you step aside. At home, my daughter was waiting with a stack of college brochures. She spread them across the table: law, economics, political science. She asked which one I thought she should choose. I laughed softly. "Choose the one that makes you restless when you are not working on it," I said. She tilted her head, considering. Restless. That was the word she carried upstairs. My husband poured 2 glasses of wine and asked how it felt to watch others use my tools. I told him it felt like watching someone pick up a sword you had carried too long. You are glad it still cuts, but your arm remembers the weight. He raised his glass. "To lighter arms," he said. I raised mine. "To sharper swords." The next morning, another headline ran: Rotterdam Injunction Cites Barnes Precedent. I folded the paper carefully and placed it in the same box where page 47 rested. Not as a trophy, but as proof that words, once written, can ripple farther than you ever intended. The final moment of clarity came on a Sunday morning. I was sitting at the kitchen table, sunlight spilling across the wood, when my daughter walked in with a notebook. She placed it in front of me, open to a page filled with her handwriting. At the top, she had written in bold letters, "Promises are contracts too." She said it was for her civics class, an essay about fairness in government. I read her words slowly. She wrote about page 47, not as a weapon or a scandal, but as an example of how ordinary people could be protected by extraordinary preparation. She ended with a line that stopped me cold. "My mother taught me that peace is built, not inherited." I closed the notebook and looked at her. She was smiling, shy but proud. In that instant, I knew legacy was not in the newspapers or the court filings. It was in this girl who carried forward the discipline of writing things down, of keeping promises dry and unbroken. That afternoon, I returned to the clinic. The young lawyers were huddled around screens, drafting motions for the next hearing in Rotterdam. They turned when I entered, expecting direction. Instead, I told them plainly, "You do not need me here every day. You have the skills, you have the fire. My role now is to watch, to advise when asked, to make sure you do not forget why you began." They nodded, some reluctantly, but I saw the spark in their eyes. They were ready to carry the fight. Walking home through the city, I passed the Tower of Helios. Its glass walls glittered in the afternoon sun, indifferent, eternal. Once it had felt like a cage, then a battlefield. Now it was just another building in a city full of them. I felt no anger, no triumph, only distance. At home, I unlocked the fireproof box and looked at the folder one last time. Page 47, the clause that had once been my shield and sword, lay quiet and ordinary. I realized I no longer needed it close. Its work was finished. Its lesson lived in others now. I placed the folder back, shut the lid, and slid the box deep into the shelf. I did not mark it. I did not need to. That evening, sitting on the balcony with my family, I listened to the hum of the city and the laughter of my daughter drifting from inside. I breathed in, slow and steady, and understood. Peace was not silence. Peace was continuity. And I had finally found mine. Years pass faster when you no longer measure them by quarterly reports. My life now unfolds in seasons, autumn leaves drifting across Riverside Drive, winter snow settling in quiet layers, spring blossoms painting the sidewalks, summer nights humming with street music. I no longer live by market open and close. I live by mornings with coffee, evenings with my family, and the occasional trip to the clinic or classroom. Helios stands taller than ever, its glass sharpened by renovation, but I rarely glance up at it anymore. Catherine has made good on her promises. Pensions restored, bonuses tethered to responsibility. The company posts profits steady and unremarkable. No more scandals, no more headlines. Sometimes stability is the most radical achievement. The clinic has grown. What began in a cramped loft now fills an entire floor of a modest building downtown. The young lawyers I once guided are no longer beginners. They argue cases in federal courts, publish articles that make their way into policy drafts, and train interns of their own. I sit with them once a month, reviewing filings, answering questions, but mostly I listen. They no longer need me to tell them what to do, they only need me to remind them why. My daughter is 18 now, her acceptance letter from Yale pinned to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like an apple. She chose political science, though she pretends it was a coin toss. I see the truth in her restless eyes. She is already drafting essays on ethics and governance, already arguing with professors in emails before classes even begin. Sometimes she rolls her eyes when people call her my daughter, as if the phrase is both a crown and a chain. I remind her gently that she is her own name, her own page, her own story. One evening, as we walked by the river, she asked me if I thought page 47 defined me. I told her no. It revealed me. It showed the world the discipline I had carried quietly for years. But it was not my life's meaning. My life's meaning is sitting here, walking beside me, asking questions that matter. She smiled and squeezed my hand. In that moment, I knew I had finally broken free from the shadow of the tower. News of the case reached me one rainy morning. The clinic, now full of lawyers younger than my daughter, had taken on a technology conglomerate accused of hiding billions in unfunded retirement obligations. It was the sort of case that once would have landed on my desk at Helios, back when I believed saving a firm meant saving the world. I read the filings they sent me, dense with numbers and exhibits. The work was meticulous, the timelines crisp, the arguments grounded not in outrage but in evidence. I saw echoes of my teaching in every line. They had taken my methods and sharpened them into their own. I declined their invitation to join the courtroom team. Instead, I sat in the gallery, unnoticed by the press, while they argued. Watching them, I felt a strange mixture of pride and humility. They stood firm, their voices steady, their documents precise. They no longer needed me to anchor them. When the judge issued a preliminary ruling in their favor, the room erupted with restrained relief. Lawyers hugged quietly, journalists dashed for exits, cameras blinked. I stayed in my seat, still, absorbing it all. For years I had fought to prove betrayal could be confronted. Now I was watching the next generation do it without my hand guiding theirs. Afterward, one of the young attorneys spotted me near the exit. She hurried over, breathless. "We cited you in our brief," she said. "Your language from page 47. The precedent is spreading." I smiled. "Precedent is not mine," I told her. "Precedent belongs to everyone willing to enforce it." She looked as if she wanted to argue, then simply nodded. Her eyes shone with gratitude, but also with something else, ownership. That was the moment I realized my legacy was no longer mine to carry. It lived in them now. That evening, I returned home to find my daughter sprawled on the couch, reading a thick political theory book. She glanced up and asked how the case had gone. I told her the truth. They carried it farther than I ever could. She closed the book slowly, her lips curving into a thoughtful smile. "Then maybe you are done," she said. Her words startled me. Done. The sound of it felt foreign. But as I sat beside her, listening to the rain against the windows, I wondered if she was right. The idea of being done stayed with me for weeks. It followed me in the quiet moments, in the grocery store aisle, on my morning walks along the river, in the pauses of conversation with my husband. Done. Could I really step back completely, not just from Helios but from the fight itself? One afternoon, I sat in my study, the old folder still tucked away in the fireproof box. I had not opened it in months. I realized I no longer felt its weight pressing against me. It was there, yes, but like an old scar, present, visible if I searched for it, but no longer painful. Being done did not mean forgetting. It meant trusting the structures I had built and the people who now carried them. It meant acknowledging that legacy is not a chain but a seed. So I began to shift my time. Fewer visits to the clinic, more evenings cooking with my daughter, experimenting with recipes neither of us could master, but laughing all the same. More mornings lingering over coffee with my husband before he left for the hospital. More lectures at universities where the only stakes were whether students left the room believing governance mattered. I found joy in simplicity. Folding laundry while listening to jazz. Reading novels that had nothing to do with finance. Planting herbs on the balcony and marveling when they actually grew. For the first time in decades, I allowed myself the luxury of ordinary life. Still, sometimes the world came knocking. Invitations, requests, pleas for help. I answered sparingly, choosing only what aligned with my values. A nonprofit fighting wage theft. A law school symposium on ethics. A guest essay for a journal about fairness in contracts. I did not seek the spotlight, but I did not fear it either. I had learned that my voice could carry without consuming me. One night my daughter asked me directly, "Do you miss it? The adrenaline, the battles?" I thought carefully before answering. "No," I said. "What I miss is the clarity of knowing exactly what needed to be done, no matter the cost. But clarity is not peace. And right now, I choose peace." She leaned her head on my shoulder. "Then you are done, Mom, and that is a good thing." Her certainty warmed me more than any headline ever had. The years softened into a rhythm I had once believed impossible. Seasons turned, students graduated, cases rose and fell without my name on them. The clinic became a fixture in the city, its young lawyers now mentors themselves. Sometimes they invited me back for anniversaries or panel talks. I went when I felt like it, sat in the back when I did, and watched their fire burn brighter than mine ever had. My daughter left for Yale and wrote me letters more often than I expected. She described classes that challenged her, debates that kept her awake past midnight, and professors who pushed her until she pushed back harder. One letter ended with a line that made me laugh and cry at once. I think I found my own page 47. I kept that letter in my desk drawer, folded neatly beside the old folder. I never opened the folder anymore. Its power was no longer in the ink, but in the echoes it left behind. On a warm spring afternoon, years after the battle with Helios had ended, I found myself standing at the edge of a university courtyard. Students hurried past, clutching laptops and coffee cups, chasing futures that felt endless. I watched them and realized that none of them knew me. Not really. To them, I was a footnote in a casebook, a precedent cited in a lecture. And that was enough. I walked slowly back toward the river, the sun glinting off the glass towers in the distance. They no longer loomed. They simply stood, tall and indifferent, part of the skyline. I had given them enough of my life. Now they belonged to someone else's story. At home, my husband poured wine and we sat on the balcony in the fading light. The city hummed below us, alive as ever. I thought of the battles, the scars, the victories, the losses. I thought of page 47, the sentence that had carried me through betrayal and beyond. And I thought of the quiet peace I had finally learned to claim. Legacy, I realized, is not a monument you build. It is a seed you plant in others, and when they carry it forward, you are free. I raised my glass and whispered to myself, I am done. And for the first time in my life, the words felt like triumph.